Imagine a plane that disappeared in the 1950s with more than 90 people on board. The case is closed, the families mourn their losses, and the world moves on. But then, 35 years later, it reappears. Without warning. Without contacting the control tower. And even more frightening, it lands normally, as if no time had passed. But what investigators find inside the cabin turns everything into a nightmare beyond logic. The passengers are there, all of them, sitting with their seatbelts fastened, only they're not alive, they're skeletons, and the pilot, still holding the controls, as if he had just finished flying. The question is inevitable. How can a plane disappear for 3 decades and reappear as if it had flown straight through time? If you enjoy stories that seem impossible but make us rethink everything we know, subscribe to our channel. Every week we dive deep into the most intriguing mysteries of history and reveal what almost no one dares to tell. On the morning of September 4th, 1954, the airport in Aachen, West Germany, was busy as usual. Among the commercial flights scheduled for that ordinary Saturday, there was one in particular, Santiago Flight 513, operated by the German airline Santiago Airlines, the final destination, Porto Alegre, in southern Brazil. On board were 88 passengers and 4 crew members. None of them imagined that they were embarking on a flight that would become legendary, and that would only be mentioned again more than 3 decades later. The flight departed on time. The aircraft, a Lockheed Super Constellation, was considered advanced for its time. Fast, comfortable, reliable. During the first few hours, everything went as expected. Contact with control towers in several countries was recorded, but at some point over the Atlantic Ocean, communication ceased abruptly. Without any emergency signal or distress call, the plane simply disappeared from radar. The news spread around the world. Search teams combed the probable flight path for weeks, but found no wreckage, no oil slick on the sea, no trace of Santiago 513. It was as if the plane had been swallowed by the sky itself. The official investigation concluded the obvious. The plane crashed into the ocean, cause unknown, case closed, families devastated, a tragedy among so many others in aviation history. For 35 years, no one spoke of the flight, until on October 12, 1989, an extraordinary event shocked the air traffic control team at Salgado Filho Airport in Porto Alegre. An unidentified plane appeared on the radar, coming out of nowhere, with no flight plan and no communication. The controllers, confused, tried to make radio contact. No response. But the most impressive was yet to come. The mysterious plane began perfect approach maneuvers and landed. The astonishment grew when technicians and authorities approached the aircraft and saw the markings on the fuselage. Santiago Airlines. It was the same plane that had disappeared in 1954, intact, no apparent damage. But what was inside was much more disturbing. When they opened the door, investigators found all the passengers sitting in their seats, seatbelts fastened. No signs of struggle or panic, but also no signs of life, only skeletons, including the pilot, who was still holding the controls, as if he had just landed. How can you explain a plane that disappeared for 35 years reappearing in perfect condition, with the corpses intact, still in their seats? When the emergency team arrived at the plane, there was complete silence. There was no smoke, no smell of fuel, no sign of mechanical failure. Everything seemed normal. But as technicians and investigators climbed the ladder and looked inside the cabin, normality turned to pure terror. The first report came from the control tower at Porto Alegre Airport. The controller on duty described the situation as unbelievable. A plane had appeared out of nowhere on the radar, with no registration, no transponder, and yet it made a clean, smooth landing, as if under the command of an experienced pilot. The aircraft touched down at 3:45 p.m. Shortly thereafter, it came to a stop on the runway, and there was no further sign of life. When they tried to make radio contact again, there was still no response. As they approached the aircraft, the first thing that caught their attention was the paintwork. It was slightly worn, as if it had been exposed to the elements. But the Santiago Airlines logo was still visible. The problem? That company had ceased operations in 1956, 2 years after the disappearance of Santiago 513. The Brazilian Federal Police, civil aviation experts, and even the military were called in to examine the plane. When they opened the cabin door, they found the skeletons of the passengers, dressed in 1950s clothing, sitting as if they were just waiting for the landing to end. There were no signs of violence or depressurization. Nothing. But what shocked the experts the most was the condition of the aircraft. Despite the time that had elapsed, there were no clear signs of aging in the main components. The fuel was still in the tanks, the engines were intact, and all the instruments on the panel were working. The cabin clock, however, showed a strange time, 4:08 p.m. Exactly 23 minutes after landing. That's when the theories began. The most popular? A fold in time. The idea that the plane had passed through a time portal, flying for 35 years without its occupants noticing. Some scientists who analyzed the case off the record said that the phenomenon could be compared to a time bubble, a space where time behaves differently from our reality. Another theory suggests that the plane was the victim of some secret experiment, perhaps by the airline itself, perhaps by governments. Some say that the Lockheed super constellation was used in tests with electromagnetic propulsion, a technology inspired by documents captured from the Nazis after World War II. A remote possibility, but not entirely ruled out by conspiracy theorists. And if you think that's crazy, wait until you hear what comes next. A few days after landing, the plane was quickly isolated by the armed forces. Journalists were barred from entering. Images taken by airport employees began to disappear from the press. In less than a week, the government declared that it was all just unfounded rumors. But local reports continued. Witnesses said they saw the plane, saw the skeletons, and also saw men in suits entering and leaving the aircraft with briefcases and instruments. This is where the alleged involvement of the CIA comes in. Documents leaked years later, never officially confirmed, suggested that U.S. intelligence had known about aerial anomalies in the South Atlantic since the 1950s. But they hid everything under the pretext of national security. Santiago 513 was just one of many covered-up cases. Over the years, the story of Santiago 513 spread around the world, especially after being published by an American tabloid called Weekly World News in 1989. The publication spoke of a ghost plane, described the skeletons, and even suggested that Brazilian scientists were studying the phenomenon. But Weekly World News was known for publishing sensationalist stories, often invented. The problem is that even though it was a tabloid, the story stuck. It began to be shared by radio stations, mystery magazines, and TV shows in several countries. And since no one could prove it was false, or even true, the mystery only grew. And this is not the only case. In 1955, Pan Am Flight 914, departing from New York bound for Miami, disappeared and reportedly reappeared 37 years later, landing in Venezuela. Like Santiago 513, the plane was in perfect condition, with passengers alive and confused about what had happened. This case was also published by the Weekly World News and remains unproven to this day. Another curious case is the famous Flight 19, a squadron of American bombers that disappeared in 1945 during a training mission over the Bermuda Triangle. No wreckage was ever found. By the way, if this kind of story fascinates you as much as it does us, enjoy the video and comment below. What do you think really happened to Flight Santiago 513? As the Santiago 513 case captured the popular imagination, one question echoed with growing force. Why has no one ever proven, once and for all, whether the story was real or just a well-told myth? That's when independent researchers, mystery hunters, and investigative journalists began to dig deeper. The result? Nothing conclusive. There was no official record of the company Santiago Airlines in 1954, at least not in publicly accessible databases. There was also no formal investigation protocol or aviation incident report in the Brazilian aviation archives about a plane with these characteristics landing in 1989. Still, some details refused to disappear. Several witnesses claimed that they had seen the plane land in Porto Alegre that day. A former airport employee, who never wanted to be identified, swore that he helped tow the aircraft to a hangar, where it was sealed and taken away days later by army trucks. Skeptics argue that it is all just an urban legend, fueled by sensationalist media coverage. A fictional tale that got out of hand and became alternative truth. But those who believe, and there are many, have an even more disturbing explanation. Perhaps reality itself, as we know it, is not as linear as we think. If we consider the hypothesis that Santiago 513 went through a temporal anomaly, what would that mean? That time, under certain circumstances, can bend back on itself. That the planet's airspace can hide points of rupture between dimensions. That the line separating the now from the then is more fragile than we imagine. What's more, if it happened once, why couldn't it happen again? The story of Santiago 513 raises more than just questions about aeronautics. It challenges our very perception of reality. After all, where does the impossible end and the inexplicable begin? Even decades after its supposed reappearance, the case still inspires theories, documentaries, books, and videos like this one. It has become a symbol of what humans fear most, and at the same time, desire most, the unknown. We may never know what really happened to that flight. Maybe it was just a well-constructed hoax, or maybe, just maybe, it really did cross time and return to remind us that there are things out there that even science cannot explain. When we first heard about Santiago Flight 513, the immediate reaction was disbelief. A plane disappearing for 35 years and reappearing intact, with skeletons in the seats, sounds like something out of a movie. But the more we delve into this mystery, the more it provokes us. Not only because of the unanswered questions, but because of what it reveals about ourselves. We are creatures who need to understand. We need to close cycles. When something escapes logic, we feel threatened. But perhaps that is precisely why these stories fascinate us so much. They poke at a deep part of our mind that insists on believing that there is still much, much more out there than we can imagine. What if Santiago 513 isn't an isolated case? What if there are other flights, other ships, other people who simply disappeared, not by accident, but because of something we don't yet understand? If a plane can reappear 35 years later, are there also places where time doesn't pass? Or where it loops back on itself? That's why mysteries like this matter. They remind us that even with all our technology, we are still learning to decipher the secrets of our own world. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment below on what surprised you most about this story. And of course, see you next time for another mystery.